So, like has already been mentioned, my name is Mallory. I'm actually the director of customer success at Humanitech, but I am also a very prominent member now of the platform engineering community. A lot of the things I've been talking about are related not just to the initiatives that people have with their MVPs, but also how do we make them successful from a change management standpoint, psychological standpoint? How do we measure success? Just gave a talk at Platform Engineering Day at KubeCon North America about this, which was fantastic. Um, so you'll see me around the platform engineering community quite a bit, but you'll also see me at Humanitech. You can reach out to me by email. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also in the platform engineering Slack community. I'm a little slow sometimes to get back to people in Slack, but that's probably because I'm in like 16,000 different Slacks. So probably the best way is to email me. You can try and find me on X, but there's not much there, unfortunately. I don't tend to use Twitter that much anymore, but still exists. Um, like I said, do appreciate the flexibility from last week. I'm also not at my normal location, generally in Canada, but at the moment in Germany. So it is dark, and you will also have to excuse the light. Couple things I want to go over today with the MVP is I want to give you a fundamental understanding of what the minimum viable platform actually is. What does that mean? And how do you need to think about it when you start the process of putting this into your platform engineering journey? There are 4 phases to the MVP, and I want to go through those with you and give you an understanding of what those look like. And I also want to walk you through what potential pitfalls you could hit are. There's solutions to these as well that I want to share that we have learned just from seeing so many people go through this process. I also want to look at going beyond MVP because that's really quite important. One of the most common things I'm asked is, what do I do after this is all done? And I want to share with you a little bit of the information about what that actually can and should look like based on my experience. Like Olivia said, there will be question and answer at the end. Feel free to dump the questions though in the chat as we're going through the webinar. Don't lose the train of thought. Put it down, and we'll get to those later. There's the Q&A session as well as the chat that you can use for that. So let's get started. The first thing is, what is the minimum viable platform, the MVP in the platform engineering context? And it's more than just a confusing acronym I made up to make it more confusing to sit inside of this space. We have 3,000 acronyms that mean the same thing. So there's IDP for internal developer portal, internal developer platform, and we added on to that with the MVP. But I think it's very important. And the reason why is because the concept of a minimum viable product is very applicable to the idea of platform engineering. And we wanted to really make sure that with this concept, we narrowed it down to thinking of that platform as a product, which is why it is the minimum viable platform. Why should you actually consider MVPs? And this is another question that thankfully is being asked less because people are really starting to catch on to the idea. But the fundamental reason why you should look at doing one of these if you have a platform engineering initiative is because you can show value very quickly. It is a proven structure. It is a pathway that has been refined and continues to be refined every single day in order to get to that value very quickly and to be able to get inside of an organization in a day-to-day use fashion. The only way to get platform engineering truly adopted is to create stickiness. And what does that is fast wins and usage. So what else happens when you do an MVP, and why is it such an important thing to think about? Well, you're going to come out of this with a pioneering team that can lead the way on innovation. Chances are this will be, if you don't already have one, the foundation of your platform engineering organization. This can also be how you identify something like a cloud center of excellence or an innovation team. Folks that are really interested in trying something new and doing things better. The other thing that's really important here is you're going to build the first version of your internal developer platform, but you're going to be doing it in the context of what your pioneering team needs in non-production requirements. So what's really critical about the MVP is it is not a production grade or production touching platform. It's important to stay off production for the beginning because you just want to get somewhere fast. When you do that, you're going to build yourself a product-like roadmap. And what this gives you is the ability to see to the future while constraining the scope of what you can achieve inside of an MVP. If we want to get to value quickly, we cannot go all over the place. We have to have a very clear definition of scope. So what's important is also building that roadmap for what it can look like in the future. As part of this process, you're also going to seek out and engage with stakeholders. So these are the people who are influential inside of an organization that can drive adoption of something like a platform. This can be not just your engineering teams, but folks in security, finance, it could be folks on the business side. There's a lot of different stakeholders that you want to consider. You may have representatives from your developer teams as well. That could be an interesting team to work with here. And I really encourage you to get those stakeholders on board quickly with the idea and keep them excited, keep them talking about it. There is a big aspect of internal marketing that comes with changes like adopting platform engineering and internal developer platforms. And it's much easier to get traction when a lot of people are excited about it. One of the other things that becomes very apparent when you start small like this and really gradually go towards scale is that you avoid having to win over every single team immediately, technical and otherwise. You can scale sensibly. There's always going to be teams inside of orgs that are hesitant to adopt something new because they've seen stuff before, they've seen things go wrong, they don't want to go down the same path. If you can show success gradually and slowly, it is a much safer way to get people on board and to also convince them that it's the right way to go. They see success, they see the value, and that's easier than just telling them that something cool might happen at the end. So when we look at how MVPs should actually be designed with those outcomes in mind, there's three primary principles that I want you to think about. The first one is that the MVP needs to be representative. So what you put together technically needs to have the basic resources and components that is common across the majority of your technical estate. I always like to say, try to hit 80% of the scenarios, leave those 20% outliers for another day. When you do that, you're probably going to be thinking about maybe a common database type that most people, if not everybody, is using. The same CI/CD systems. If you have an internal system, make sure that that is something you're already using. If most people are using Argo, make sure that that's part of your MVP. Application structure is also something to consider here. So, if you have that traditional structure of an application is broken into a front-end service, back-end services, maybe some data services and data layers as well. Make sure that what you're building, even if it's just a sandbox type app, is representative of that. When you go to show this thing to people, it needs to hit their context. It needs to hit their level of understanding and be able to be extrapolated to mean something to their day-to-day. Ingress DNS is something also that comes up here very commonly. So if you're, using something like Cloudflare, or if you have a particular way of doing ingress, you want to make sure that you are following those same principles with the MVP because it's more applicable, because that is something that actually comes up a lot as a fairly complex technical issue. Start that one from the beginning is my recommendation. The next thing you need to do is make sure that it's repeatable. So an MVP is essentially a skeleton for further adoption of any platform. You should use this as a quick start. You're going to be able to build fundamental documentation that you will iterate on. You're going to be able to build fundamental processes and onboarding structure for teams out of the MVP that you can use again and again and again to scale. It is the foundation on which your platform is built, so it's important to do it right. Think of the MVP as a quick start for onboarding new apps and teams, not just the technology that you're using, but also the mindset that you're putting in place, the procedures, the operational things that are going under the hood in order to make it successful are things you will use again. And finally, and I've said it already, but it's incredibly important that you think of this thing iteratively. MVPs are focused around what is coming later, but they are scope refined to what is here now and what we can achieve in a short period of time. So the context of creating this version that you're going to build up the platform is done with growth in mind. So we know we're going to start small, but we think about the future in how we build this thing and how we talk about it. It is important to remember that in order to get any adoption and to scale inside of any initiative, commitment is required. And it's also very important to Get yourself a very refined time period for an MVP. We tend to do them with our customers in about 4 weeks or less. 8 weeks is also sometimes common, but that's the kind of time period you need to give yourself. This has to move quickly. So how do we do this in 4 to 8 weeks? And I think that is, something that scares people when they first come into this process. But the way we make it work is by breaking it into phases and breaking it into predictable chunks of deliverables and philosophy that make it easier to get things done. What you're going to do is using that simple representative infrastructure, thinking about scale, you're going to take these 4 phases and go through each of the key components inside of them. So the first one is discovery. So the first thing you're going to do is really understand what the technical outcomes of the MVP need to be and understand what the golden paths you need to build against are. What are the most common pain points you could potentially address for your technical teams by building a platform? What are the common tasks that piss everyone off and take too much time that you could easily show as a much simpler, faster process with an MVP? You also want to make sure that your project planning and project management is aligned here. So project managers on the developer side, on the platform engineering or operations side need to be aligned on what's happening in order to make this successful. Once you've done that and you've built yourself a plan for what you're going to do, you can start the first of the technical phases, which is the integration phase. So here you're going to set up the baseline of the platform, get the fundamental infrastructure in place, connect your cloud accounts, make sure that you're able to think about things in the context of that standard layer of infrastructure, so databases, et cetera, and then get those pieces plugged in a way that makes sense in the context of the MVP. Once you've done that, you can move into phase 3, and that's deployment. So here is when the applications itself, application or applications, the workloads will come into play. So even if you're using, and a lot of the teams we work with do this, if they're using a sample app that they use for stuff like this, or it's a duplicate of a real world application, it's a sample they're building just for this with sandbox infrastructure, it's important to bring it in a way that makes sense against what the rest of the org is doing. So not only are you bringing the workloads in here, you're also bringing in the pipelines. And the reason why we break the workload pipeline side of things out from the base infrastructure integration is because it's 2 very different ways of thinking. When you think about infrastructure in terms of internal developer platforms, that is one silo effectively of information. Infrastructure should be essentially what the configs for that should be in a repository of its own. Application configuration is really its own thing on a separate repository structure. We really like to keep these separate. The job of the platform is to connect those silos, to connect the developer with the operation side of things. And that's essentially what you're doing here and why the segmentation is important. Separation of concerns, separation of thinking. It's all about making sure that the correct context is in place for each phase. And then finally in phase 4 is adoption. So here is where we're going to test the end-to-end deployment flow against the golden paths that we decided in the beginning. So if we wanted to test the difference between basic deployment with generated DNS for a PR environment, for example, we want to make sure that that is what we're able to test and demonstrate here. From there, we'll go on and start demoing the MVP to our potential customers. So those are the developers, the development teams inside of your org. This is also people in your stakeholder groups, so finance, security, all those fun folks. You also want to start to be able to have that adoption and roadmap plan in place, or at least the foundations of it. Start thinking about what it means. And we'll look at that in a little bit. There are some common things that can go wrong when you start doing an MVP, and there are also some solutions that we've identified to prevent you from falling into these. So if you see yourself going down these roads, think about the thing you can do to mitigate that from day one. If you follow the MVP structure well, you'll naturally avoid these, but sometimes it's hard to stay away from them. And realistically, the first one I would say is the hardest to stay away from, and that is rushing to complexity. So what this means is trying to solve all the problems of the world at once with your MVP. This will fail because you'll never have anything to show anybody. You'll get trapped in that consistent cycle of, well, it's not done. Nothing in software engineering is ever done. Nothing in platform engineering is either. It's a product. We're going to iterate on it forever. The best practice instead is to start small, iterate, and grow. Keep thinking about that continuous improvement mindset. You're never done. You can always do something better. You're going to engage with your customers, which are your developers, as well as your infrastructure engineers, in order to make sure what you're building as a platform suits their needs. And that is all about iteration and feedback. The other pitfall I tend to see people falling into is focusing only on tools and technology. That's great. It's fun. We're engineers. We like to play with toys that are shiny and new, but this won't serve you well in the long run. What you need to focus on instead is outcomes. Focus on those golden paths. You need to, rather than tracking what kind of technology you have in place and making sure that you're just trying all the new stuff, make sure you're actually focusing on usage and adoption as your key North Stars. Focus on outcomes, focus on solving problems rather than technical solutions. It is much easier to design a platform that way. Because remember, it's not just there to be a shiny thing, it's there to actually do a job. And with that comes the pitfall of building something that no one wants. And this often happens when you do those other two things. So to avoid that, you need to focus on those users, focus on the right level of abstraction for their needs. Abstraction done responsibly is an incredibly powerful thing. There's a lot of information actually about this inside of the Platform Engineering Fundamentals course. I basically do an entire lecture on abstractions, but if you do it right, it can be very powerful and very, very impactful. So what I want you to think about is, when you are designing your platform, focus on productivity, focus on impact, and focus on satisfaction, not just with the platform, but with the day-to-day experience itself. It's very surprising how that changes when things are done well. And the last one, which I think is now finally becoming more of a topic of conversation, is that developer experience, often in a platform engineering initiative that fails, is only focused on developers. But there is a much bigger picture than that with other stakeholders. When you find your pioneers and champions, you are building a community around solving problems. And like I mentioned before, this is all about outcomes. That means that your developer experience is broader reaching and touches a lot more stakeholders than just developers. And I think there's more value to a DevX initiative when you think of it that way. As a whole, it makes platform engineering much more accessible, and it makes it easier to adopt inside of an organization and get buy-in. And buy-in is what you're trying to get to here. Again, it's not just about making something cool and fun. It's actually about solving a problem. So I often get asked about going beyond MVP and some of the challenges that come up here. And I want to touch on a couple of these because I think they're very important before I show you a framework for going past the MVP. The biggest challenge realistically isn't taking a platform across a small organization, it's across enterprises. And the reasons why are because you have a hugely increased technical complexity. The estate covers a lot more ground. Your multi-region, your multi-business units, your all sorts of distributed factors in place that make it technically more complex outside of the actual infrastructure in place. Enterprises also tend to require a much higher level of stakeholder management for an entire organization to adopt a change, or even a segment of the organization. It's not just about getting a CTO to sign off and say yes to something. It's actually about a deeper change management process, especially in a bigger org. And that can be a huge challenge and something you want to be able to face head on. At enterprise scale, in order for adoption to be successful, it has to be well planned. It has to be well managed. Without that, it will fail. It's much easier in a smaller organization to be a little bit more agile, be a little bit more flexible. But in a big org, this just doesn't fly. It does not work when there's lots of red tape in place. One of the other things I talked about earlier is that 80-20% scenario. This could shift. Those 20% of outliers that you see in terms of use case may actually be your critical components, and you may want to consider them coming onto the platform sooner than later. This could be services that everyone else is dependent on because they're incredibly business critical. And yes, they may have their own unique infrastructure and pipeline needs, but potentially they need to be taken care of first. Otherwise, they become a bottleneck. And that is really something I only see inside of enterprise orgs. Even then, it's fairly rare, but it is something that pops up and something I want you to be aware of. And the last thing with enterprise that is challenging is that there's legacy systems, and they haunt the technical estate. They also haunt the change estate and the way that people think. Old school is a thing inside of enterprise more than I see in sort of the smaller, more medium-sized engineering organizations. So how do you fight these things? Well, there's a lot of things you can do. I'll highlight a couple here and then I'll go deeper into a few things. Engaging high-level stakeholders about value and ROI early on is probably the safest thing you can do. Even if you hit bumps along the road, if they can see the value, they can see the return on not just financial investment, but time, you are more likely to counter that issue of complexity and of the change management problems you're going to face. When you also use focused phase project plans and roadmaps, very similar to what is typically done in managing products, you're going to avoid a lot of that technical complexity. You can sort of work around it in a way that makes sense and is very intelligently planned. In order to do that well, you need to have strong and aligned project management collaboration between platform and application teams. This is incredibly critical. When these teams do not work together, things will fail. You also need to start thinking about that outlying 20% I mentioned early on and build migration strategies to support their onboarding and then being able to support the rest of the organization or the ones that are particularly dependent on those. And finally, you need to consider where and if legacy systems are even an option, if they fit in, and if there are any initiatives moved away from these. And we'll look at this a little bit more. In terms of engaging your high-level stakeholders, I want to focus in on this because I think it's critically important. But the biggest piece of advice I can give you is to think outcome-focused. So start early, share project plans with them, and make sure that the success criteria you define and the outcomes that you define are aligned with what their needs are. So this is mostly about aligning against business priorities. This is stuff like time to market, being revenue driven, trying to outcompete a highly competitive market. There's all sorts of stuff you can tie platform engineering into. What's important is that you regularly report on the progress towards those goals and those outcomes. Even small wins, team light bulb moments like, man, this just made X process easier. That is an important thing to report on. Schedule regular demos and updates as part of what in some businesses are called QBRs, so quarterly reviews, or other higher management level meetings. Get in there, show something, talk about what you're doing. And with that comes showing return on investment as you see it. Time is money and money is time. Any process that reduces time or saves it on costs is a big win. So make sure you highlight those at any possible opportunity. In terms of aligning the project management strategy with a migration plan, I would say that I'm going to come back again to this project management collaboration. It's so important that your project managers between application and platform engineering teams are aligned on outcomes, are aligned on goals, objectives. They collaborate on what the timelines need to look like, how the phases need to play out, and what blocks might be in place. Migration plans are also really important to build here. So this is going to consider not just the technical complexity of the platform changes, but the logistics behind it, the reasons why teams are being brought on and when they are, and we'll look at that a little bit as well. So just think about iteration cycles for each cohort of teams or application group that you're bringing on board, and you'll have a much easier time building that plan. In terms of legacy services, this is going to require a little bit of deeper thinking, and you don't always have a plan in place for replacing them. That's okay. Some enterprises have this, some don't. If there is a plan in place to gradually sunset these systems, it's important to take the projects that are replacing them, generally they're greenfield, and start those from day zero on the platform. This is a best practice. Greenfield should always come first when you think about onboarding. And if a legacy system is being replaced by a greenfield project, that is a great place to show value very quickly. If a legacy service is to remain, it's probably never going to align with platform engineering or cloud native as a whole. It's not going to fit into that 12-factor application model. Maybe eventually this will change, but it's not worth putting a lot of effort into if there's not an initiative to do this at the moment. Save yourself the pain of doing that. In terms of going beyond MVP as a progression, it's not as scary as you think. If you make the effort to plan adoption and design early on, you're going to put yourself in a situation where you have a likelihood of success that is higher than people who don't. The MVP tends to be part of a proof of concept. So in a proof of concept, you're taking developers' needs, you're taking best practices, existing tool chains, recommendations inside of the industry for best practices that might not be inside your org already, and putting those into a proof of concept. How I normally see this broken up is not just into the MVP, but it's in a seed and scale production readiness framework that we've also built that allows people to sustainably get an application on board, get day-to-day usage inside of a production environment or headed towards production environments that can easily show exactly what day-to-day use looks like. The MVP itself, it's really tough to show kind of that day one, day two usage at scale. You're showing something quickly that is basically a concept. And then with the production readiness, you are actually building something out for a real world scenario. Once you move on from there, it's important that every time a new team adopts, you get feedback, you prioritize that feedback, and you evolve the platform accordingly. And that will allow you to bring on additional people each and every time you do that. With adoption planning as a whole, what's important to think about is these 5 sort of rules. And these are my rules, my quick steps to success with adoption planning. And this is sort of the last thing I'll leave you with here before a little bit of a closing statement. The first thing that's important to think about is defining objectives and goals. And again, this whole thing has to be outcome oriented. You can't just make it up as you go along. You need to define these and you need to keep them in mind the entire time you're thinking about adoption. Decide on the cohorts, the groups of teams or applications or business units that you're going to onboard and how you're going to prioritize them. Like I said, greenfield should almost always come first. Think of it that way. Think about what those teams are facing and how you can help them. You then need to do discovery. So do this by cohort. It's technical requirement, it's use case requirements. You need to look at this inside of the cohorts and understand where they can fit into each other. The other thing you have to do is to develop an internal marketing strategy in order to go beyond the cohorts, but also to keep people updated on how the platform is evolving. This can be very challenging, especially for engineers. We're not always the best at marketing things, but there's a lot of resources available in terms of how to talk to broader audiences about technical initiatives. And there's also a segment of the platform engineering certification course, the fundamentals, that goes into exactly this. Finally, you need to take all 4 of those things and deliver an adoption model and a plan for scale. It will get iterated on, it will change, it will adopt or adapt over time, but you have to have a foundation to work on to start. So build that and be prepared to change it, but having it is the first step to being successful with adoption at the end of the day. So to close it out, I love this quote, and it is, if you want something you have never had, you must be willing to do something you have never done. Platform engineering can be a challenging practice to adopt. Internal developer platforms do require a lot of challenging assumptions, a lot of challenging the way we've done things for a long time, but they're also very rewarding. And if you want those outcomes bad enough, if your organization can seriously benefit from them enough, making it happen means just putting your feet right in the deep end and getting going. So I wish you luck on your platform engineering journey. There's lots of great resources on the platform engineering website to take a look at, including the talks from PlatformCon. Like I said, if you have any questions that come up after this, let me know. But otherwise, yeah, we'll open the floor for some questions now.
Yes, thanks, Mallory. Guys, please ask away. We already have one question here in the Q&A chat box, so I'm going to read it out. I work on VMware Infra. I am new to platform engineering. Please suggest where to start to learn or apply this landscape of technologies. Is there any free playground to connect these landscape tools pipeline?
I mean, when you look at VMware stuff and you look at VMs as a whole, they are very much designed to make things easy for developers to begin with. Um, One of the first sort of platform engineering-esque solutions was Heroku, for instance. And what you see a lot of the time when people start thinking about VMs is they start thinking about making the pipeline accessible in a very simple way, but also making the resultant deployment accessible. And that's sort of the fundamentals of platform engineering in a nutshell from a technical perspective. There is a lot of tooling that you can think about in terms of VMware itself. I mean, I work a lot directly with Kubernetes deployment, so that's sort of my own context, but there is some of the stuff inside of this landscape that also talks to VMware. The platformengineering.org website has a tooling page. I would maybe start there and look at the reference architectures and try and find one with VMware at its center. Um, Again, much of platform engineering is focused on stuff like Kubernetes because that is really where the complexity comes from that developer and operations perspective. But VMs are still very much part of these discussions. So I would start there. I'm just trying to think of if I've seen anything recently, specifically with VMs, but I don't like, again, my context is very much Kubernetes based, so that doesn't really help. Uh, I think of just trying to understand the outcome I want to achieve by making a platform around whatever technology I need to use and understand what I have already that I can use to make that experience easier. So start with the tooling page, think of the outcomes, and then start thinking what you can fit into the pipeline to make that work.
Yeah, I just shared the link to the platform tool landscape in the chat there. So,
Perfect.
yeah, another one. So, first of all, thanks for an amazing session. How can we know the best practices and challenging scenarios? Provide some info.
Oh, well, it really depends on the challenging scenario. So I think there are challenging scenarios from a technical perspective. Those are generally easier to figure out. Sometimes it's experimentation. Sometimes it's also just seeing what other people have done. But I will say the biggest challenges come from an organizational change perspective, from that change management, that psychology perspective. That is really freaking hard. Um, what I do a lot of is what I jokingly call platform therapy, but that's going in and trying to understand how to make that change easier inside the context of a particular org. Where you can go as a resource for this, I mean, Platform Con, there's some great talks on the technical challenges and the org ones. In the last two actually there's been some really good stuff come out of that. So I would start there. The platform engineering community, put something out there. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable and say, hey, here's where I'm at. How can I make things better? We do address some of these inside of the platform engineering course, the fundamentals, but I think starting with the community is also a very good place, and starting with reviewing the landscape as a whole. And also being prepared to ask yourself some hard questions. That comes up a lot. Sometimes it's hard to admit when something is broken from an organizational perspective.
Yeah. That was all the questions. Guys, do you have any more questions from Mallory while we have her here? I think
Cool.
I think that might be it, Mallory.
All right. Well, no problem.
Yeah.
Some people are just very quiet.
Yes, yes. Don't be shy, guys. Don't be shy if you have any questions. Okay. I think that's it, Mallory.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for a great presentation.
No
And
worries.
guys, thank you so much for joining. And I hope you have the best Christmas and a happy new year, because we're not going to see you. So have the best break and enjoy it. And thanks so much again, Mallory.
Have a great holiday, everybody, and we will see you